Okay, this video is Carl Rogers, academic hero number 18. Carl Rogers lived from 1902 to 1987. He was an American psychologist from the town of Oak Park, Illinois. He had grown up on a farm, and he had grown up in an atmosphere of very strict religious upbringing, strict ethics. He had initially wanted to be a missionary, but he then changed his mind. What I liked about Carl Rogers as a psychologist was he emphasized the need to be open and positive and supportive of the patient, to be authentic in oneself. He was heavily influenced by Soren Kierkegaard, who's another interesting philosopher. And there's several threads of thought going there. One of the big ones with Kierkegaard was, how does a man decide who he wants to be? And that's an important decision for an intelligent person. The world sort of forces you into a pattern, and you have to conform to some extent so you can make money and support yourself and your family. But on the other hand, if you don't maintain your own sense of individuality, you don't like yourself and you won't achieve much. He, in his own time, Carl Rogers was heavily resented by a lot of different groups. Some of the psychoanalysts didn't like him because they had their way of looking at the world, and the psychoanalysts were very powerful at that time. They sort of dominated psychiatry as well. In addition, around that time, the behaviorists, like the B.F. Skinner School, were also very positive, and they had a very sort of limited view of what man was possible. If you want to talk about a group of people who saw man as little more than a simple animal, a big version of a mouse, that would be B.F. Skinner and the behaviorist school. So Carl Rogers was very positive. He reminded me sort of Abraham Maslow, and if you want to say that psychoanalysis will emphasize the negative side of human nature, this is from your childhood, this is because you wanted this or that with your mother or your father, and in my opinion, kind of crazy. Carl Rogers was more emphasizing the positive side of human nature, the individuality of the person, respecting that, nurturing that, as opposed to B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, saying, just use rewards and punishments and you can make a person do anything. Okay, so Carl Rogers' quote, humans require acceptance. When given acceptance, they will usually pursue the positive. The better therapist I have become, the more I have been vaguely aware of my complete subjectivity when I am at my best in this function. Soren Kierkegaard points out that the most common despair is to be in despair of not choosing or willing to be oneself, and that the deepest form of despair is to choose to be an other than oneself. On the other hand, to will to be that self which one truly is indeed the opposite of despair, and this choice is the deepest responsibility of man. The therapist's procedure, which they had found most helpful, was when the therapist clarified and openly stated feelings which the client had been approaching hesitantly. Carl Rogers. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in that. And one of the things to see is a lot of the common philosophies of a successful life, a happy life, come back to this concept of self-knowledge, understanding oneself, understanding one's strengths and weaknesses, understanding one's values, and living a life consistent with that. And that goes back to back to Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. And it's going to tie in a lot of these philosophers and psychologists, the good ones, sort of tie into these common themes. And I think it's valuable to understand this stuff because when you understand yourself better, you understand other people a lot better, and you get along with them better. I noticed myself, I was a little bit socially awkward. I was so socially isolated through college and med school that I almost had to relearn a lot of this stuff and it was helpful to me. So anyways, and also I had considered going into psychiatry like my father, but then I chose interventional radiology, imaging guided surgery, because I saw that as a way to keep in touch with a whole wide variety of medical things and be, like a surgically, clinically, procedurally oriented person. Anyways, okay, here's Carl Rogers continuing. The more I can be genuine in the relationship, the more helpful it will be. The more acceptance and liking I feel towards this individual, the more I will be creating a relationship which he can use. The safety of being liked and prized as a person seems a highly important element in a helping relationship. The warmer, the more accepting, the more honest the relationship between the therapist and the patient, the more likely it will benefit the patient. So this kind of brings home what, again, the best psychologists and psychiatrists will say. There's a component like of friendship, like a psychiatrist should be, in a large extent, I believe, like an intelligent friend who cares about you, who's trying to help you. And some people have criticized that, saying, oh, it's like paying to have a friend, a good psychiatrist, good psychologist. Well, maybe there's some truth in that, but it's still a valuable thing. Why did we value the advice of our parents, our siblings, our friends? Because we know them, we know they care about us, and we are comfortable with their advice. We feel safe talking to them. Carl Rogers continues, experience is the height of authority. What is most personal is most universal. Okay, now that's great advice in the sense, and that's what they say again about a great artist. They have, recognized that to be their true self is their best way to be as a great artist. Look at Beethoven, for example. Okay, Carl Rogers continues. The goal of life is to be who you truly are. Now you're going to hear that same thing coming from Carl Jung. You're going to hear that coming from Kierkegaard. You're going to hear that coming from from Nietzsche, from a lot of the great philosophers. Carl Rogers continues. The therapist needs to be real about his feelings so that his words and body language are congruent. Congruent is needed to build trust. Okay, so Carl Rogers is saying, yeah, you have to be authentic. The person has to feel comfortable that you are who you really say you are, and that they can trust you and be comfortable with you, feel safe with you. So Carl Rogers, he developed his school of psychotherapy, was called the Unconditional Positive Regard, UPR, and it's also called client-centered therapy. Unconditional Positive Regard accepts the person, respects them without judgment or evaluation. UPR enables an open conversation between a psychologist and the client. You even call him a client instead of a patient, sort of a teacher and a student relationship in a sense. Carl Rogers' style of open-ended questions were also called the Rogerian approach to communication. And it emphasizes that the psychologist is going to listen carefully and really try to understand things, to see it from the patient's perspective. That's another key point, being able to see things from the patient's perspective instead of just, telling the patient, here's what you need to do, you're ignorant, here's the correct answer, that's what you need to do. That kind of shuts down the conversation. And a lot of times the patient just needs somebody to talk to so they can work through all their thoughts and figure things out for themselves. Carl Rogers is known as the father of person-centered therapy. And so each one of the schools of psychology will be like one of the six blind men looking at the elephant. We've seen that metaphor previously. And to better understand human metaphor, it's good to read all these psychologists. I found it kind of fun to read them. You don't need to read their books. That takes too much time unless you really like them. But just read through their quotes, and you can get their famous quotes. You can get a good sense of the different styles of these psychologists and psychiatrists. So some of the ones I found worth reading, Carl Jung, we did him recently. Adler, I thought was real helpful. B.F. Skinner, I thought was kind of a jerk, but he's a smart guy. So it was interesting also, because that tends to be the default setting of how people are thought of as B.F. Skinner. So it's good to know that's how you're going to be viewed in a lot of environments. Maslow's self-actualization is good. Carl Rogers. Okay, I also thought the cognitive behavioral therapy ideas of Aaron Beck and David Burns are good. Evolutionary psychology is helpful sometimes to produce a way of putting together a story on why something is the way it is. Not always right, but it's useful. Okay, so Carl Rogers continues. Whenever the therapist was less than accepting, the patient perceives that as threatening. Yeah, especially in the beginning. Once a person knows each other better, you can be more judgmental, and that's part of being helpful. But in the beginning, they gotta be comfortable speaking. It's almost like reciprocal self-disclosures. So Carl Rogers continues, in my early professional years, I was asking the question, how can I treat or cure or change this person? Now I would phrase the question this way. How can I provide a relationship which this person may use for his own personal growth? Yep. Okay, Carl Rogers continues. What is most personal and unique in each one of us is probably the very element which would, if it were shared or expressed, speak most deeply to others. This helped me to understand artists and poets as people who have dared to express the unique in themselves. So that's Carl Rogers. And again, you can see the echo of Ralph Waldo Emerson in that statement. All right, Carl Rogers continues. The congruent person is genuine, real, integrated, whole, and transparent. The non-congruent person tries to impress, plays a role, puts up a front, and hides behind a facade. Congruence between feelings and actions can never be total, but choosing to be real with others is the single most important decision a person can make. Yeah, we're real and honest with our family and with our friends, so if you want to get along with another person, being real and honest with them makes them more comfortable with you. And that's opposed to sort of like, I think this professionalistic doctor personality behavior, doctors have to be that way to a large extent because they don't know who they're dealing with at the beginning of a conversation, and a lot of patients are cognitively impaired. Some of them are crazy, so you see this generic stereotype personality doctors put forth, but as they gradually get to know the patient, they should be more friendly and open. I've seen it. I've been around doctors who are, great, good, average, below average, and the great ones tend to be real friendly and personable. Okay, so Carl Rogers continues. When we put together a prescribed curriculum of similar assignments for all students and using lecturing as almost the only mode of instruction, standard textbooks by which all students are graded, then we can guarantee that meaningful learning will be at an absolute minimum. So that's kind of funny that the way school is usually taught is about the worst way for people to learn. Most of generic schooling is not really about learning. It's like, I think a lot of it's about putting people into categories. Okay, Carl Rogers continues on education here. Testing of the student in order to see if he meets some criterion held by the teacher is directly contrary to significant learning. Carl Rogers continues, I believe that traditional teaching is almost a completely futile, wasteful, overrated function in today's changing world. It is successful mostly in giving children who can't grasp the material a sense of failure. Carl Rogers. Yeah, you think about it, who were your best teachers? They were the ones who were personal, that you remembered them as a personality, as a unique individual, because they shared things with you that were meaningful to the two of you. So, when a teacher can go beyond that and be that way, you got a good teacher. If the teacher just, has you memorize something from a book, you don't learn that much from that usually. Unless you're specifically choosing that class because you want to learn that subject versus, most grade school, high school, it's all required stuff. You have to take that class. Carl Rogers continues. Every individual exists in a continually changing world of which he is the center. The person reacts to the world as it is experienced and perceived. This perceptual field, held by the individual, is for the individual reality. And the best vantage point for understanding behavior is from the internal frame of reference of the individual himself. Carl Rogers. I don't know who said it, but someone else has said, if you want to understand a person, you have to understand them from their own point of view. And understanding from their own point of view enables you to communicate with them better. Carl Rogers continues, significant learning changes the way a person thinks or the way a person acts or how they perceive. The only kind of learning which significantly influences behavior is self-discovered or self-appropriated learning, that the truth has been assimilated in experience. Carl Rogers. So what he's basically saying there is the patient has to see the truth for themselves. And so letting them talk a lot, letting them sort of discover their own better perspective is going to be more memorable and useful to them than just sort of telling them what to do or what you think. Okay, Carl Rogers continues. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. I have learned that my whole organismic sensing of a situation is more trustworthy than my intellect. When I can relax and be close to the transcendental core of me, then I may behave in strange and impulsive ways in the relationship, ways that I cannot justify rationally, which have nothing to do with my thought processes. But these strange behaviors turn out to be right in some odd way. At these moments, it seems that my inner spirit has reached out and touched the inner spirit of the other. Our relationship transcends itself and has become something larger. Carl Rogers. Yeah, and I think basically when you're just yourself, you're open, you feel comfortable with each other. You have an intuitive resonance between you and another person, and that's typical of friends and family. Carl Rogers continues, the optimal therapeutic conversation is the ultimate of subjectivity, individualization. Okay, and the reason why I love that quote is because, doctors are always told to be objective. And also getting back to that cold, scientific, rational sense of self. But that doesn't work with people. People want you to be individual with them and personal. So if you want to have a good conversation with somebody, it has to be subjective. And that's funny because that's the opposite of way of how a doctor is trained. Can you be both at once? To some extent. But the person has to feel that things are good between you and them. Okay. Carl Rogers continues, in the minds of most behavioral scientists, and he means like B.F. Skinner, a man is not free, nor can he ever really free himself, nor can he commit to any purpose, since he is controlled by factors outside of himself. Therefore, neither freedom nor commitment is even a possible concept to a modern behavioral science, as it is usually understood, Carl Rogers. So what he's basically saying is, the B.F. Skinner behaviorist school of thought about an individual, and to some extent the psychoanalytic thought about an individual, is they're just trapped by the rewards and punishments in their own life, and they really don't have any free will. So you want to get back to like a Calvinistic determinist point of view. It's a very limiting view of of who a person is and what they're capable of. To B.F. Skinner, a person wasn't much more than a big lab rat. And that's actually how a lot of academic centers think, and they shape their view of shaping human behavior. Like they're just basically high IQ lab rats, and a person is, more than that. So Carl Rogers continues, it is impossible to start a therapeutic relationship if the person seeking help does not want to improve. It is impossible to convince someone to change for the better. The desire to improve is a precondition for improvement. Carl Rogers. Yeah, and that, of course, goes with the typical person, fat and sick, diabetic, hypertensive, cognitively impaired. Well, let's say before they're cognitively impaired. They can't learn about nutrition and health unless they really want to, unless they recognize there's a problem with their health. And the typical person sort of accepted their fat fate, says it's genetic, versus saying, well, gee, all over the world there's lots of skinny, healthy people. Why can't I be like them? Maybe the way I grew up to eat is not the best way. So things that increase trust in relationship and communication, of course, open, warm, friendly, credible. I think doctors should dress well. It just sort of creates respect. You dress well when you go to a funeral out of respect. Dressing well is a sign of respect towards other people. A doctor, I think, should be physically fit. I mean, in the process of learning how to be physically fit themselves through diet, exercise, lifestyle, etc., they can then teach that to a patient, a friend. If a doctor's all fat, how are they going to, teach a person about healthy nutrition? Reciprocal self-disclosure, there's all kinds of communication theories along those lines. Multiple simultaneous conversation threads is characteristic of a conversation between friends, and that's why it's a good way to have a conversation. It's a sign of friendship. Like attracts like to some extent. There's truth in that. Mirroring of body language is positive, warm, good sign. Using colloquial vocabulary. These are all things friends just naturally do. And also the good doctors, the good psychologists, this is how they communicate. Avoiding private topics which might seem judgmental initially, but eventually you'll work towards some of those things, and you have to do that. Okay, Carl Rogers continues. The major barrier to mutual interpersonal communication is our very natural tendency to judge, to evaluate, to approve or disapprove the statement of the other person in the group. Yeah, you shouldn't do that in the beginning, but eventually you have to let a person know what you think. They're asking your opinion, And that's part of being a good friend. But in the beginning, you got to mostly just let the other person talk. Carl Rogers continues, you have to be orientated properly to have a useful conversation. The goal is to help each other, to listen carefully, to tell the truth, to cheer each other. Empathic, attentive listening, active listening, with the goal of making things better. So those are some of Carl Rogers' ways of thinking. I think they're really good. He's one of my favorite psychologists. And that's all the slides, so I hope that's helpful.